no rancher dared claim it. Nearly 19 hands high, scarred from battles long past, Lot 27 towered in the pen like a shadow made flesh. Mean enough to smash through steel rails, feared enough to end the careers of men twice as tough. By the end of the auction, its price had fallen lower than a worn saddle, and still no hand rose. The crowd muttered, shifting uneasily, as if the black giant itself could hear their hesitation. Then, from the back, a figure stood. He walked with a limp that told of wars fought far from Texas soil. A man who had already stared death in the face and walked away, once a Navy SEAL, now just a ghost among civilians. He wasn't a rancher, he wasn't a gambler, but when his eyes locked on the beast, he didn't see a monster. He saw a comrade left behind. The sun was just breaking over the flat expanse of the Texas Panhandle, lighting up the dust that danced restlessly across Little Creek, a small town built on grit and survival, where summers came without mercy and dreams dried up quicker than the red earth beneath your boots. Most mornings passed without much more than the hum of flies and the drag of weary footsteps. But today was different. Today was auction day, the town's heartbeat pounding in the heat. By 8, the lot was alive with motion. Pickups crowded the yard, their beds stacked with hay. Men leaned against rails, coffee black as tar steaming in their hands. Women haggled over colts, children tugged at sleeves, and traders calculated margins in the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and manure, punctuated by the metallic ring of hooves striking concrete. Gates clanged, chains rattled, voices rose and fell, in rhythm with the auctioneer's chant. And yet, in all that noise, a silence seemed to hang around Lot 27. The kind of silence that makes even seasoned men shift their weight and glance away. When the SEAL raised his hand, gasps cut through the crowd. No one knew his name, no one knew his story. But in that moment, as the hammer fell, the town of Little Creek felt a shiver it hadn't known in years. For what no one realized not yet was that this choice would not just save a broken horse. It would ignite a reckoning, one that would ride straight through the heart of every man, woman, and secret buried in Little Creek. It was rarely dramatic. Buyers didn't waste breath on poetry. Their talk was lean and pragmatic. The cost of hay. Whether last week's rain had been enough to break the dry spell, how much fence line needed repairing before the heat settled in for good. The auction was a place for business, not sentiment. The first lots moved quickly. A pair of sturdy rans with steady eyes fetched a decent price changing hands without fuss. A Palomino May mare stepped out next to foe tucked against her side, earning a rare soft murmur from the crowd. A string of geelings followed ranch talk with no surprises. Saddle, broke serviceable, the kind of animals a man could trust to move cattle without making trouble. They sold fast, the rhythm of the morning, like a hymn everyone knew by heart, numbers called bids. Raised the gavel, tapping in final agreement. It was all predictable until the yard crew began to clear a wider path. The crowd shifted, sensing the change before anything was said. Two young hands wrestled with the heavy gate at the far end, sliding it across with effort. Their movements were tighter, more cautious than before. Behind them, a pen rose higher than the others, its rails braced with cross beams. The paint along its uprights was scraped raw steel, polished to a shine, where something enormous had rubbed against it with violent force. Lot 27, someone muttered, and a ripple of attention spread through the yard. This was the pen everyone had whispered about all morning, unlike the Jellings or Mayers that came. Before, Lot 27 had required reinforcement. Two handlers stood rigid at either side, their posture telegraphing unease. One kept his boot braced against the gate, as though expecting it to lurch forward. The noise of the crowd softened, replaced by a hush that carried more weight than silence. Inside, the pen stood a horse that seemed to bend the rules of proportion. Nearly 19 hands at the withers, the stallion was black from poll to tail, the kind of black that swallowed light, as if a storm had taken flesh. His body was a fortress of bone and muscle, a neck thick as a tree trunk, draped in tangled ropes of man. His tail swished with the weight of a rope itself, each movement deliberate, heavy. Along his left flank ran a scar, long raised pale, against the dark coat. It was no accident of nature. It looked like the memory of fire, the mark of iron pressed deep. The stallion didn't pace nervously like other horses. He didn't shuffle or sweat in anxiety. He stood as though he owned the ground beneath him, front feet planted, hind quarters coiled. When he lifted his head, tendons shifted under the skin like cables, and his eyes, dark, recessed, unblinking, scanned the crowd with a dare. Without warning, he struck the rail with a front hoof. The entire pen shuddered. Steel rang. Like a bell. The vibration running through the boards into the boots of those standing too close. A collective flinch passed through the line of onlookers. Someone hissed Jesus, and another voice snapped back. Hush in, the tone adults use when a child edges too near the fire. The handlers kept their distance, clipboards pressed against their chests, like shields. One cleared his throat and read from the sheet, though the details were already rumored. Shy stallion. Age uncertain, likely 6. Estimated weight 1,200 kilos, 2,600 pounds. Prior owners 3, unable to maintain. History of gate failure. Incident resulting in injury to handler. As if to punctuate the statement, the stallion shook his head, mane whipping, and struck the rail again. The sound reverberated across the yard, sharper, harder. A sound that said, steel was not a barrier, but a challenge. Hell of a horse. A man near the front muttered, though his tone lacked admiration. Hell is right, another replied. From the block, Ray Callahan stepped forward. Ry had spent 30 years selling horses, and he carried himself with a weary confidence of a man who had seen nearly everything. Long arms, easy, slouch, but his eyes were alert. He took off his hat, ran a hand through prematurely white hair, and set the hat back on like armor before leaning into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice grated through the crackling speaker gravel made electric. Lot 27, biggest animal we've seen here in a long while. I won't sweet-talk you. He's the hardest, too. No one flinched at the word hard. Everyone there carried their own measure of it. But Ry pressed on. You buy him, you buy the whole of him. He's got bone, and he's got drive. You know what that can mean in the right hands. You also know what it can mean in the wrong ones. 3 sets of hands claimed they had him. None do now. Step up today and step up, knowing what you're stepping into. He gave the smallest nod to the yard crew. One of the boys tapped the gate, with his boot, testing whether it would hold. The stallion lifted his head to the sound and froze ears pricked, forward still as a stone. But the kind of stillness that warned of sudden violence. Ry raised his voice. We'll open the bidding at 1,000. Silence. He tried again, rolling the chant with practiced cadence. 1,000. Do I hear one big bone like this breeding for years? If you know what you're about. E10. Who give me 1-0. The crowd stared at boots fiddled with coffee lids, cleared throats. A man coughed, the sound rough as a stalled engine. Wind dragged its nails down the corrugated siding of the warehouse, filling the pause with an eerie scrape. 800 Ray, said his voice, still carrying cheer, though the edges frayed. 800 for the biggest animal on the ground today. Again, silence. 6, he called. I'll take 6. Still nothing. The pressure of quiet settled heavier than noise. Somewhere, a plastic lid snapped onto a cup. Sentinel shifted his weight feathers at his fetlocks, stirring dust. He struck the rail again, a reminder that money was not the only price here. 400, Ray announced. Folks, you're stealing him at 4. A woman near the back shook her head slowly, regret written plain. It meant no, and also that she wished she could have said yes. Another man tilted his hat forward, signaling he wouldn't even pretend to consider. 300, Ray said flatly. His voice landed heavy, stripped of rhythm. The loudspeaker carried it like a stone laid between them all. The silence stretched longer than anyone could bear. Ray Callahan had let the number fall to $200, his voice flat, stripped of its usual sing-gong rhythm. The offer hung in the air like smoke, choking the space between the rails and the crowd. Not a hand stirred, boots shuffled on, dirt, not out of eagerness, but the opposite, a quiet prayer to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. At the back, the clerk laid his pencil aside with weary finality. He reached for the folder marked for killers, a man about to complete a distasteful but familiar ritual. The pages crackled like dry bones when he opened them. The sound carried sharp, as a gunshot in the tense stillness. The stallion's ears flicked at the noise, precise as a radar dish, but no one else moved. The crowd began to avert their eyes. Men who had stared boldly at every other lot now studied the toes of their boots with sudden fascination. A woman who had leaned against the rails sighed through, her nose slow, regretful, and turned away. Everyone wanted the same thing, that this spectacle, this failure, would be over, that Lot 27 would vanish from their sight, carried off to the end. No one wished to name out loud. Ray adjusted his hat fatigue lining the edges of his mouth. He had sold hard. Horses before mean horses. Dangerous ones. But this This was something else. He drew in a breath, ready to drop the gavel, ready to end it. That was when a voice in the crowd spoke. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound was steady, cutting across the silence like a blade through canvas. Heads turned toward the shadowed edge of the yard. From the line of onlookers, a man began to move. He came slowly, as though testing each step before he trusted the ground. At first, he seemed just another drifter, a face half hidden under the brim of a plain cap's shoulders, wrapped in a jacket that had seen better years. But the limp was unmistakable. Each pace carried the echo of an old injury, the kind that never healed clean. He favored one leg, but forced himself, not to an old soldier's trick, a refusal to let weakness become identity. As he emerged into the hard light of the auction yard, more details sharpened. His hair was already salted with gray, though he was not yet an old man. His eyes were set deep, watchful with a weight that said he had seen more endings than beginnings. He wasn't young, he wasn't pretty, and he wasn't dressed to impress. But there was something in the way he carried himself straight back, even in the limp, balanced, even in the uneven stride that spoke louder than clothes ever could. Whispers rose like wind through dry grass. Mercer, someone breathed. Jack Mercer, Navy man, SEAL, they say. Thought he left years ago. Retired, busted up in Afghanistan or Iraq. No one knows for sure. Eyes followed him now, as though the silence had shifted allegiance. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Ray. He walked until he stood 3 yards from the reinforced pen and stopped. For the first time that morning, the black stallion stilled completely. The two figures faced each other, man and horse. One scarred inside, one scarred outside. The air seemed to pressurize between them, pulling the rest of the yard into a hushed orbit. Jack Mercer's gaze locked on the animals. He saw not just mass and menace, but recognition. The scar along the left flank pulled him backward through time, back to a desert training ground half a world away. He remembered a horse, massive, furious, thrown into the chaos of a joint program, where men and beasts were tested under explosions, gunfire, firelight. He remembered shrapnel flaring one night, burning across a black coat. His throat tightened. The stallion tossed his head, and the movement was eerily familiar. It wasn't random. It was precise, a gesture once sharpened by repetition, conditioned to signal readiness. Jack's breath caught. He wet his lips, took one small step, closer to the rail, and whispered something too soft for the crowd to catch. A clipped word, 2 syllables carved from the lexicon of his old unit. The stallion's ears twitched, not random, not startled, intent. Recognition flickered in the dark eyes, gone in a heartbeat, but undeniable. Jack knew. He straightened, inhaled, once, and raised his hand. The movement was steady, deliberate, the kind of motion a man makes when he has already walked through worse doors than this one. 150, he said. The words were neither loud nor dramatic, but they carried as though the yard itself leaned in to deliver them. Ray Callahan froze, mouth half open the gavel, pausing midair. He scanned the crowd until his eyes found the speaker. A ripple of disbelief broke across the watchers. He's out of his mind. 150. That's a suicide note, not a bid. Hell, that's less than a saddle. He's paying pocket change to buy his own coffin. Jack didn't answer them. His eyes never left the stallion. The animal blew once, nostrils wide, as though testing the air. He hadn't moved closer, but he hadn't turned away either. Jack's voice came again low, but unwavering. His name isn't Lot 27. He drew in a breath of the kind you take before stepping back into a fight. His name is Sentinel. He served with my unit. The words detonated in the silence. The crowd broke into a clamor of whispers and half-shouted questions. What's he saying? That horse military? SEALs use horses can't be true. Some laughed, nervous and thin. Others frowned uncertain. But no one doubted the conviction in Mercer's voice. He hadn't spoken for them. He had spoken to the animal, Sentinel. The name rolled through the space like it belonged there. The stallion flicked an ear toward the sound. His dark eyes narrowed, focused. For the first time since stepping into the pen, he seemed less like a storm trapped in flesh, and more like something waiting to be called. Ray Callahan studied Mercer longer than the moment required. He knew enough about men to see the difference between bravado and conviction. The one in front of him carried no showmanship, no desperation to impress. It means only certainty. The gavel hovered, then came down. One sharp crack. Lot 27, Ray said, his voice measured to Jack Mercer. $150. The release of tension was almost physical. The crowd exhaled as one relief mingled with curiosity and doubt. Some looked grateful they hadn't been forced to gamble with the black giant. Others stared at Mercer with a kind of wary fascination, as though watching a man step onto a wire strung over an abyss. The clerk scratched out the line in the kill buyer folder and scribbled a new entry in the sales sheet. Paper rasped again, this time not with finality but with reprieve. Sentinel snorted, shook his head, and stamped the ground once. The sound rang out like punctuation. Jack Mercer lowered his hand, but his eyes remained locked on the animal. He had made his choice. The rest of the town could talk all it liked. In the echo of the gavel, in the weary hush of the crowd, one thing was certain. The fate of Lot 27 had just shifted, and so had the story of Little Creek. The yard crew moved in quickly after the gavel fell, but their haste had nothing to do with efficiency. It was the wary kind of speed men used around explosives fast enough to finish the job, cautious enough to keep distance. Lot 27 had been sold, but no one trusted that a shift in paperwork meant a shift in danger. They opened the narrow corridor leading to the trailer. The stallion snorted ears, flattening heads, tossing as the steel gates clanged shut behind him. He didn't step so much as charge chest, slamming the side of the alley hooves, throwing sparks where they struck metal. The handlers gritted their teeth, drove him forward with swinging gates, and slammed the divider across before he could whirl. Inside the trailer, the black giant threw himself against the walls. The whole rig rocked on its springs. Men stepped back, muttering curses. Damn thing's a demon. Mercer's a dead man walking. Ray Callahan oversaw it all, jaw set, hat pulled low. He turned once to see Jack Mercer standing off to the side, arms loose at his sides, face unreadable. The clerk thrust a clipboard forward. Jack took it without breaking his gaze on the trailer and signed where indicated. His signature was spare, practiced like a man used to leaving marks on the forms he barely read. You're crazy, Mercer, someone muttered. Jack didn't answer. He simply stepped closer to the ramp, eyes locked on the restless weight inside, as if the animal's rage was a language only he intended to learn. The drive out of town was slow and rattling. The trailer thundered behind the post, battered Ford pickup like a drum of war. Inside, the stallion never stopped, moving. Hooves hammered the steel floor, a steady percussion of defiance. Every impact jolted through the chassis, made mirrors shiver, and rattled bolts loose. Tom Riley sat behind the wheel, one hand steady, the other draped casual over the rim. Though nothing about him was casual, his eyes kept flicking to the side mirror, watching the trailer sway under each blow. He had the look of a man too tired to be startled and too experienced to be calm. Christ, Jack, he said finally, voice gravel worn from too many cigarettes and too many deployments. You sure about this? That's hell on four legs back there. Jack sat in the passenger seat, shoulders square, gaze fixed on the slatted vents where black hide flashed each time the horse turned. His jaw flexed once before he answered. No, he said evenly. He's not hell. He's a comrade. One left behind. Tom snorted through his nose, the sound half amusement, half pity. He shook his head, eyes narrowing against the glare of sun on the windshield. I thought we left all that behind, he muttered. Now, here you are, dragging it home in a steel box. Jack didn't reply. Silence filled the cab, broken only by the whine of tires on gravel and the relentless pounding from the trailer. For a while, the two men rode together, in the same way they had ridden before, sharing space, sharing danger, speaking only when necessary. Jack's ranch wasn't much of a ranch anymore. The old wooden gate sagged on rusted hinges, paint long since surrendered to weather. The fencing along the property line leaned drunkenly in places patched, with wire or nothing at all. Beyond it stretched acres of dry grass, brittle from too many summers without mercy. The house stood small against the wide skyboards, sun-bleached tin roof, groaning whenever the wind pulled at it. To one side sat a lean-to barn patched together with scrap. Behind it, a corral had been cobbled into existence. New posts mixed with splintered old ones, sheets of wire stretched taut where rails had failed. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. Jack had made sure of that. Tom pulled the truck to a stop and let out a low whistle. You're kidding me, he said, staring at the makeshift pen. You're putting him in there. That thing couldn't hold a half-broke brunk, let alone whatever you just bought. Jack opened the door, dropped to the dirt, and stood a moment with the wind tugging at his jacket. His face was stone when he answered. Not forever. Just long enough. Tom looked at him sidelong, disbelief thick in his frown. Long enough for what Jack's eyes stayed on the trailer for us to remember each other. The ramp dropped with a clang that rolled across the empty yard. Sentinel exploded out of the darkness, like a shell leaving the barrel. His hooves hit dirt hard enough to spray gravel. For a moment, he stumbled, then gathered himself and surged forward, circling the pen at a pace that blurred muscle and shadow. Tom swore and stepped back. Jack stayed still, arms loose, eyes steady. The stallion tore around the perimeter, testing every seam. He rammed his chest into one corner, leaned hard into another, shoved his muzzle against the latch of the gate as though counting weaknesses. His movements weren't wild panic. They were deliberate, methodical, a prisoner cataloging the cell. Dust rose in sheets, blurring the lines of his massive frame. When he finally halted, he stood in the center, head high sides, heaving eyes locked on the man. Outside, Jack didn't move. He let the silence hang, let the horse draw its own conclusions. Later that afternoon, Jack carried 2 buckets, one of water, one of feed, into the pen. He slid them through the narrow gap he'd built in the rail, careful not to offer his hands. The water sloshed, catching sunlight and trembling reflections. The hay smelt sweet in the dry air. Sentinel ignored both. He stalked the perimeter, ears, pinned muscles coiled. Not hunger, not thirst, only vigilance. The chickens in the side yard scattered in panic when he let out a short, sharp roar from his chest. It wasn't the neigh of a barn horse. It was something harsher, primal, a sound that carried warning in its bones. Tom leaned on the fence, arms folded, watching. "Looks like a convict to me," he said, checking the bars, plotting the break. Jack rested his forearms on the rail, gaze never leaving the stallion. His voice was quiet but steady. At least he still wants to fight. That means there's something left inside him. Tom shook his head and walked back toward the truck, muttering about men who carried ghosts home. Night fell heavy across the panhandle. The wind rose with it, whining through the gaps in the fence, rattling the loose corners of the barn roof. Jack lay on his narrow bed boots, still on half asleep, but never fully surrendered. Years of conditioning had left him trained to wake at the smallest sound. The sound came. King. Metal striking metal. Steady, deliberate, not frantic, not fear. Calculation. Jack pushed himself up the springs, creaking beneath him, and crossed to the window. The moon was sharp tonight, throwing silver light across the yard. In its glow, the black giant stood against the fence, massive head, lowered shoulders, braced. Each blow of his hoof rang out like a blacksmith at work, driving force into the rails. Sweat gleamed along the stallion's neck. Dust rose in small clouds, where hooves churned the dirt. His eyes glowed, not wild, but focused. Jack watched, jaw tight. It wasn't rage at him. It wasn't personal. This was something older, deeper. "He's not angry at me," Jack murmured into the empty room. "He's angry at the world." The words hung there, echoing back to him like an unwelcome truth. By dawn, the noise had stopped. Jack walked out into the early light, tools in hand. The corral bore the evidence, bent braces, rails sprung out of alignment, bolts loosened. Sentinel stood in the far corner chest, rising, slow gaze fixed on him with unblinking intensity. Jack crouched, set his hammer against the first warped plate, and began to work. Blow after blow fell, straightening, resetting, not because he believed it would hold forever, but because it had to hold today. His hands, scarred and callous, trembled, slightly with each swing, not from fear, from recognition. This was not going to be a short fight. This was a campaign. When the work was done, he rested against the post, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist, and looked across the pen. Sentinel hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, watching, always watching. Jack let the hammer drop into the dirt, leaned on the fence, and let the words slip out in a whisper only he could hear. "We still owe each other one moment of trust." The wind carried the murmur away, but the stallion's ears flicked. For the first time, Jack allowed himself the smallest hope that the horse had heard. The first escape came sooner than Jack expected. One morning, he stepped out into the dusty light, bucket in hand, only to find the gate of the pen yawning open. The lock which he trusted dangled, broken, twisted as though some invisible wrench had pried it apart. Scratches marked the wood and steel where hooves had pawed and teeth had worried at the latch. Sentinel hadn't just forced his way out. He'd located the weakness, worked at it, and exploited it. Tracks led off the yard in heavy prints deep into the red soil. each step pressed with weight, deliberate, carrying power enough to leave craters in the dirt. Jack's heart kicked hard. If the stallion broke into a neighbor's pasture, tore through their fences, or panicked their stock, and the fallout would be ugly and fast. He grabbed a rope and followed the trail, boots crunching dry earth pulse climbing in his throat. The prince carried him across brittle grass and out toward the ridge. The land rose sloping into a shallow hill. At the top stood Sentinel, silhouetted against the morning sky. His head was high, chest expanded with sharp breaths, nostrils steaming. He looked less like an animal than a sentinel indeed, a watchtower set against the horizon. Jack didn't raise the rope or shout. He moved in slow, wide arcs, his body. Language open, unthreatening. Sentinel wheeled once ears flat, a rumble vibrating in his chest. But when Jack pressed a little closer, not with force, but with patience, the stallion eventually shifted his weight, angled his body, and allowed himself to be turned back. They walked home in a silence heavier than words. Jack felt the rope slack in his hand, more an illusion of control than its reality. Sentinel wasn't broken. He had simply chosen for the moment to allow return. The second escape came days later. Jack woke to a deep metallic thud, followed by another sharper. He threw off his blanket, tugged on boots, and stepped into the night. The panhandle air was still moonlight, spilling silver across the fields. The pen was open. One section of rail caved inward, splinters jutting out where wood had yielded. Hoof prints scarred the playa, dirt beyond. Sentinel had jumped. Jack followed the tracks again further, this time across a dry creek bed where stones shifted under his steps. On the far side, the black shape stood waiting immense against the slope of a low hill. Moonlight outlined him, a creature sculpted in shadow and iron. Jack slowed, heart tight in his chest. The stallion didn't bolt. He didn't graze. He only stood, eyes locked, ears forward, as if evaluating the man who came after him. Jack let the rope fall, slack at his side. He kept his posture low, his voice calm. "Easy," he murmured. Tone, even carrying not command, but conversation. "No fight here." Minutes stretched. Finally, Sentinel's head dipped almost imperceptibly. Jack edged closer, lifted the rope without swinging, and touched it gently against the thick neck. Sentinel huffed, a flared nostrils wide, but did not retreat. Jack drew a long breath of relief. On the walk back, sweat cooled on his back despite the chill of night. Thought needled him sharp and undeniable. He's not running to disappear. He's running to test me. Jack knew then that he couldn't keep patching mistakes. The pen had to be rebuilt, not for show, but as if he were fortifying a base. The next morning, he set to work. He dug holes twice as deep, hitting clay and watering it to drive the posts further. He hammered steel rods down into the corners, buried cross beams, and added diagonal braces until the structure groaned with its own solidity. Heavy timber replaced the weaker rails. Each corner bristled with chains, crisscrossed like scars, locked tight with twin latches and a carabiner clipped through. By noon, sweat drenched him, shirt sticking to his back, hands raw and blistered. Red soil streaked his jeans, caked under his nails. He paused only to drink, then went back to it, setting nails, tightening bolts, driving each piece home with deliberate force. Every strike of the hammer echoed. Memories, field fortifications hammered into foreign earth sandbags, stacked against blast. The endless grind of building safe zones in unsafe lands. The work felt the same. Exhaustion blurred into muscle memory. "This is no different than a forward operating base," he muttered, planting the next post. Only this time, the enemy doesn't carry a rifle. By sundown, the corral looked less like a ranch pen and more like a barricade. Sentinel watched the whole process, ears swiveling, tail lashing as though cataloging the man's countermeasures. Jack adjusted his approach to feeding too. He never entered the pen, now never. Forced proximity. He set the water bucket through the low gap he'd cut into the rail, pushed hay through a narrow slot, and then stepped back, always leaving space. At first, Sentinel met the offerings with contempt. He knocked the bucket over, sent water, spilling into the dust ears, pinned flat in defiance. The hay he trampled before circling back, to nose at it only after hunger-twisted necessity. Jack didn't scold or coax. He sat on the ground outside, back against the fence post, arms resting loose, gaze steady. He offered no reward when the horse ate, no reprimand when he resisted. He simply existed there, silent, consistent, morning and evening without fail. Over days, a rhythm began to shape itself. Buckets clattered hay, rustled the stallion ate. The man stayed. Each evening after the tools were put away, and the pen mended once more, Jack stood by the fence with thoughts he didn't speak to anyone else. This horse isn't evil, he told the night voice low, almost prayer. He's just surviving. He understood the mind of captivity too well, the way constant vigilance hollowed a man, the way anger became the armor you wore when you had nothing else. He had lived that once in compounds where hours stretched long, and men measured sanity by counting breaths. One night, he lingered at the fence while Sentinel lingered opposite eyes, like embers from the dark. The wind slid across the grass, cold and restless. Jack lowered his voice, words meant for himself as much as the horse. Not forever, he said. Only until we understand each other. The stallion didn't move, but one ear flicked forward, then back. A small sign. Enough. Jack pressed his palm to the rail, feeling the grain beneath his skin. The wind carried the words away, but he felt lighter having spoken them. A week passed under this uneasy truce. The pen stood firmer now, every post reinforced, every joint tightened. Yet each night the sound still came, the hollow ring of hoof on steel, the dull boom of a chest pressing into rail. Not constant, not panicked. Measured testing. Jack grew accustomed to it. His days fell into a cadence morning, feeding hours of repair or reinforcement evening, a ritual of silent presence at the fence. Sentinel pushed always, but never, vanished into the horizon. Each attempt felt less like an escape and more like a question. Will you hold? Will you stay? The man and the horse circled each other in this way, weary, but present. By the end of the first week, Jack collapsed onto his cot one night with exhaustion clinging to his bones. He stared at the ceiling, breathing slow, letting the silence sink in. Outside, the stallion shifted in his pen hooves, crunching softly, no violence in the sound. Jack whispered into the dim air, not sure whether he meant it for the horse himself or the ghosts that trailed both. He's still here, and so am I. For the first time since he had signed the paper at the auction yard, the thought didn't weigh like a curse. It felt against all odds like the start of something. The day doctor, Lauren Hale, arrived, began with dust. A silver pickup rolled down the rutted lane, raising a copper cloud that curled in action through the panhandle heat. Jack watched it from the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, boots planted on the steps. The truck pulled up by the corral, an idled engine ticking. From the driver's side stepped a woman in her 40s, lean but strong, her posture squared, as if she'd spent her life moving among creatures larger than herself. A stethoscope hung loose around her neck, not for show, but because it belonged there like a carpenter's hammer. She shut the door, looked once at Jack, then passed him toward the pen. "Clint called you," Jack said by way of greeting, voice flat as the land. Lauren gave a short nod. "He thinks you'll need help before that horse kills you." Jack didn't flinch. He sipped his coffee, eyes steady. He might be right, but I didn't ask him to send anyone. "You didn't," she said, walking closer. Boots crunching gravel. That's what worries people. Men who don't ask. She didn't enter the corral. She stood outside the fence, hands tucked in her jacket pockets. Weight shifted just enough to say she could move fast if she had to. Sentinel noticed immediately. His head swung, ears pre-cricked, body tight as wire. Lauren watched without blinking. She studied how the horse shifted weight from one massive shoulder to the other, how each hoof landed with deliberate care. She noted the stillness before motion, the coiled restraint that meant energy wasn't wasted. Her eyes tracked the slow expansion of his chest when he breathed the sound. Clean, strong. "He's perfect in the body," she said. Finally, too perfect. Either he's so tough he doesn't register pain anymore, or he's learned never to show it. Her gaze narrowed. "The brain's where the wound lives. You won't find it with a stethoscope." Jack leaned against a post, arms crossed. He gave no argument. He only nodded once as though she had spoken a truth he'd already carried. Sentinel snorted, pawed once at the dirt, then turned in a restless circle, his eye never leaving. The strangers at the fence. Lauren's tone softened, not pitying, but practical the way a surgeon might. "Explain the odds. Don't look for a big story here," she said. "Don't make it a test of manhood. Horses don't work that way. They want rhythm, routine, not breakthroughs." Jack's eyes flicked toward her, shadowed by the brim of his cap. "You push for drama, he'll push back. Twice as hard," she went on. "If you try to prove something, he'll prove something worse." "I'm not proving anything," Jack said, quiet but firm. I just need him alive. The faintest curve touched Lauren's mouth, not quite a smile. Then you've got a chance. A slim one, but it's there. Sentinel blew through his nostrils, shaking dust into the air. The sound felt like punctuation to her words. That afternoon, another truck rolled into the yard. Older Russ streaked its muffler, coughing before it died. Out stepped Frank Dillard, broad-shouldered, weathered his skin, lined by both sun and bitterness. He was in his 52nds, though he carried himself like a man still ready to fight if cornered. His eyes cut toward the pen before they cut toward Jack. He leaned an elbow on the fence gaze, locked on Sentinel. The stallion froze, ears pinned muscles tight, as if he remembered the man as, well. I used to own him, Frank said, voice growly like stone dragged on. Simple stone. Damn near lost my life for the mistake. He tugged his shirt aside, revealing a long puckered scar running across his ribs. 3 bones broken, 20 feet of pipe, rail torn out, and a good hand who won't set foot on my place again. Jack said nothing, only rested a hand on the top of the post, waiting. Frank's eyes burned equal parts anger and fear. That animal will kill you, same as he. Almost killed me. Best sell him or better end him before he gets the chance. Jack lifted his chin voice even. Maybe. But I don't leave comrades behind. Frank barked a laugh, dry and humorless. Comrades? That's no comrade. That's a monster. Jack's eyes never wavered. Not to me. To me, he's Sentinel. For a long moment, silence stretched. Then Frank shook his head, spit into the dirt, and turned back to his truck. The door slammed, the engine coughed, and the vehicle rattled away in a haze of dust. When quiet returned, Jack walked back toward the corral. Sentinel stood in the far corner, half in shadow, watching every movement. His gaze was sharp, unrelenting, but no longer panicked, only measuring. Jack leaned his arms on the fence close enough that the stallion could smell him, not so close as to crowd. His voice came soft, meant for the ears of one. They see a monster, he said. I see a comrade. The seal creed echoed in his head, words, branded into memory from years long past. No man left behind. It wasn't ceremony now, it was vow. He didn't need to announce it to Lauren, or Frank, or anyone in town. His decision was already made. His job was to keep showing up day after day until the horse knew he meant it. Sentinel's ear twitched, catching the sound of his voice. Jack rested a hand on the rail, and for the first time since the auction yard, he felt the faintest crack in the wall between them. Not victory, not even progress, just presence. It would have to be enough. Jack began to change his posture, toward the fight. For weeks, he had answered every challenge with labor building, reinforcing hammering steel, into the soil, as if he could outmuscle the black stallion's rage. But one morning, instead of reaching for tools, he dragged an old folding chair from the shed and carried it to the edge of the corral. He unfolded it just outside the rail and sat. No rope, no halter, no whip, nothing but his presence. At first, Sentinel dismissed him with contempt. The horse wheeled his body so that his hindquarters faced the man, a gesture sharp with a warning. He paced, the perimeter nostrils, blowing dust ears, swiving as if to say, I see you and I don't care to. Jack didn't move. He settled his elbows on his knees, clasped his hands together, and let the weight of stillness sink in. Minutes. Stacked into an hour. Sentinel circled less, then stopped circling altogether. He didn't soften, but he tolerated. The next day, Jack did it again, and the day after that. By the end of the week, Sentinel no longer turned his back. He kept his distance, but the lines of his body were different, watchful, not defiant. Muscles coiled, but no longer braced to explode. Jack spoke only sparingly, voice low, steady. He never used command tones, sometimes a single word, sometimes none. The sound was closer to prayer than conversation. He learned to let silence carry the message, I'm here. I'll be here again tomorrow. Every evening, the yard held the same image. One man, one horse sharing a patch of ground, divided by rails bound, not by force, but by repetition. It was on one of those evenings with the wind humming through the fence wires that Jack let words slip he hadn't planned. His voice was little more than a murmur, meant for the dusk. I know what it feels like, he said, being locked inside your own anger. I lived there once. He didn't expect a reaction, didn't even expect the horse to hear. But Sentinel, who had been tracing a slow circle in the dust, paused. His ears prick-ricked, angling toward the sound. He didn't approach, but he listened. Jack exhaled, shoulders sagging. Slightly. He hadn't meant to confess. The words had simply climbed out of some buried place. Still, the moment mattered. Sometimes admitting pain aloud wasn't about who heard. It was about breaking the silence inside yourself. For the first time since Sentinel had arrived, Jack felt that a door, small, invisible, but real, had cracked open. The next morning, he carried water to the pen, as usual. When he slid the bucket through the gap, he said the name. Sentinel. The syllables hung between them. The horse jerked his ears, stopped chewing, and lifted his head. His eyes found Jack sharp and immediate. For weeks, he had only stolen sidelong glances, never offering the full force of his gaze. Now he turned his entire body, squaring up both eyes fixed on the man. The look was long, unblinking, something more than instinct. It wasn't surrender, but it wasn't rejection either. It was appraisal. Jack's lips tugged into a faint smile. "Yeah," he whispered, "that's your name. Sentinel. Guardian, my comrade." The horse blew once through his nose, then lowered his head again to drink. But Jack knew the name had landed. Several days later came the moment he hadn't dared hope for so soon. The afternoon sun slanted across the corral, painting everything in copper and shadow. Jack sat on his folding chair, the dust warm under his boots, while Sentinel paced less than usual. His circles narrowed like a spiral, drawing inward. Jack held still, heartbeat steady but loud in his ears. The stallion approached in increments, hooves silent on the packed dirt. First, 20 feet, then 15, then 10. His chest rose, and fell with heavy, deliberate breaths. When the distance closed to arm's length, Jack didn't move. His hands rested loose on his knees. He lowered his gaze, avoiding the predator's stare, offering respect instead of challenge. Sentinel's head dipped. His breath washed over Jack's hands, hot smelling of hay and dust. Whiskers brushed the air above the man's knuckles. Jack resisted every urge to reach out. He let the horse make the choice. After a tense heartbeat, the muzzle touched the skin lightly like testing, the edge of a flame. Jack lifted his hand only after that, slow and careful, letting Sentinel control the contact. His fingers hovered, then brushed the great neck, just behind the jawline, a place where horses guarded themselves fiercest. Muscle tensed under his palm cords, shifting like cables. For a moment, Jack feared the explosion, the lunge, the violence, but none came. The horse stood breath and heartbeat, mingling with his own. In that stillness, silence became communion. For the first time, they shared a rhythm. The crunch of tires on gravel nearly shattered it. A battered pickup rolled to the yard. Jack didn't move, but his gut clenched at the intrusion. Tom Riley climbed out, stretching his back with a grunt. He had come often since the auction, bringing feed, sometimes just company. He lifted a hand to call across the yard, then froze. His eyes locked on the sight before him. Sentinel, the killer horse, stood still, while Jack Mercer's hand rested on his neck. No biting, no striking, no terror in the whites of his eyes, and just presence. Tom's mouth worked once, twice before. The words made it out. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Jack turned his head just enough to catch his old teammate's stare. He raised one finger to his lips, signaling silence. Tom nodded almost reverently and stepped closer, but not too close. His boots stopped in the dust a good 10 yards away. He spoke softly, all roughening his tone. "Good God, Jack, he's letting you touch him." The words carried more than astonishment. They carried belief, reluctant, fragile, but real, that the impossible might not be impossible after all. Sentinel snorted once a short burst of air and eased back a step. Jack let his hand fall, not pushing the moment. He knew enough to recognize that trust built too quickly could crumble under weight. The horse retreated a few paces, head still high, but no hostility in the movement. Motion, only caution. Jack stayed seated, letting his arms rest loosely. No pursuit, no pressure. He watched Sentinel settle in the shade, sides rising and falling in steady rhythm. "Thank you, Jack," murmured just loud. Enough for the animal to hear. "Thank you, Sentinel." The stallion's ears flicked once, then returned to neutral. For Jack, that was enough. For the first time since the trailer door had clanged shut behind the horse at the auction yard, Jack felt the tightness in his chest ease. He drew a long, measured breath, and when he exhaled, it didn't scrape like gravel. Something had shifted. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. It wasn't safety, but it was seed. Tiny, fragile, alive. The man rose from his chair slowly, joints stiff, and walked back toward the house. Behind him, Sentinel lowered his head to graze, unhurried, as if granting permission for the man to leave. The corral, the ranch, the sky, they all felt, changed, though nothing outward, marked the difference. Only Jack's chest carried proof, a seed of trust planted, deep and beginning to root. Jack didn't rush. He knew how fragile the last victory had been. The breath on his hand and the first touch on the stallion's neck. It wasn't a bridge, it was the first plank laid across a river. Step wrong, and the whole thing could tumble. So he changed his tactics again. He brought out a halter and lead rope, but not to use them. He draped them over his shoulder as casually as a jacket, let the sun warm the leather and the wind carry its smell. Sentinel noticed immediately. His head jerked ears, sharp body tense. Jack didn't press. He only walked to the corral, hooked the halter on the top rail, and sat down on his folding chair. The horse circled wearily at first, keeping space between himself and the new intruder. The dangling loop of rope, the dull shine of metal buckles. Jack didn't move. He let dust gather on in his boots, while the halter hung in plain sight. The second day, he did the same. This time, Sentinel slowed when he passed the rail. He stretched his neck, sniffed the air, then continued on. Hooves, striking in a steady rhythm. On the third day, Jack raised the halter, slowly holding it at arm's length. Sentinel flared his nostrils, blew hard, then back 2 steps. Jack lowered it immediately, set it back, on the rail, and returned to stillness. No punishment, no reward, just presence. By the end of the week, Sentinel walked within reach of the fence, lowered his nose, and investigated the leather with a curious snort. Jack let him breathe on, then pulled it away. The horse shook his head, but didn't flee. The progress was microscopic, but, for Jack, each inch was a mile. It was the following Monday when he tried the halter itself. Jack moved slow, every motion deliberate. He stood at the rail halter, loose in his hands, lead rope coiled and still. He waited until Sentinel came near, enough that the horse could smell the leather near enough to choose. Then Jack lifted the noseband just to chest height. Sentinel stiffened his entire frame, vibrating with a thought of resistance. His eyes rolled once, white showing, his muscles coiled. Jack spoke low. Easy, Sentinel. No fight, not today. Minutes dragged heavy as hours. Sweat ran down Jack's spine, though the morning was cool. He didn't advance. He didn't retreat. He just held. Sentinel snorted once, loud and angry, then slowly dropped his head. His breath came longer, steadier. The whites of his eyes disappeared. Jack eased the band up, slipped it gently across the broad muzzle. Sentinel froze, neck rigid, but he didn't explode. Jack adjusted the crown strap, left it. Loose, no pressure. For the first time since the auction, the black stallion wore a halter without violence. Jack's lungs emptied in a long, controlled exhale. Good, he murmured, hand light as air. Against the rope. Good, Sentinel. The horse shifted, but he stayed, not conquered, not beaten, choosing stillness. Jack let the moment linger, then released the buckle, lowering the halter again. He didn't try to keep it. He only gave the horse the experience that it could happen without pain. That night, he slept with a sense of something almost forgotten relief. Lauren Hale came back the next morning. Her silver pickup rattled into the yard, scattering chickens. She stepped out, adjusting her jacket eyes sharp on the pack. Corral. Jack didn't wave. He only lifted a hand palm outward, signaling for patience. He was already inside the rail halter, hanging from his fingers. Sentinel stood a few feet away, ears twitching, but body steady. Lauren slowed her stride, boots crunching softly. She stopped just short of the fence. Is that what I think it is? Jack gave a down, half smile. Depends what you think it, Island. He slipped the halter over the yes. Muzzle again. Slow, careful. Sentinel braced, blew once, and then settled. Jack secured the strap, not tight, just enough to hold. The horse stood. No panic, no fight. Lauren's eyes widened despite herself. She folded her arms, studied every twitch, every breath. She waited a full 2 minutes before she spoke. It's not defense anymore, she said. Her voice carried both wonder and caution. He's not just tolerating, he's choosing. Jack stroked the rope once with his thumb. Choosing trust, he said softly. That's better than obedience. Lauren exhaled almost a laugh. I've seen horses survive war zones. I've seen them follow orders that kept soldiers alive. But I've rarely seen one come back from what this one's been through. Keep steady, Jack. Don't ask for too much. I won't, he said. Not until he offers. Sentinel flicked an ear as if to underline the pact. In town, word traveled faster than dust. At the coffee shop near Main Street, men leaned over chipped mugs whispering, "That killer horse let Mercer touch him. Swear to God." Hale saw it herself. At the feed store, a different version spun. "It's just worn out. Big animal like that fight too long gets tired. That's all." But others weren't so sure. If anybody could do it, one rancher muttered while weighing sacks of grain, "It'd be him. Man's got the look of someone who's already buried his share of battles. Horses know that." By the time the school bell rang that week, the kids had turned it into legend. They drew pictures in the dirt, as behind the swings. Giant black stallions with red eyes, men in uniforms riding them through smoke. To them, it was a fairy tale. Come. Alive, the devil horse, tamed by a soldier who whispered like the wind. The fear that had once kept people away from Mercer's ranch was giving way to curiosity. They wanted to see. They wanted to believe. Jack ignored the talk. He stayed with the horse. That evening, he removed the halter, folded the rope neatly, and hung it on the rail. Sentinel stood close, watching, but didn't turn away. His eyes tracked Jack, not with hostility, but with awareness. Jack leaned on the post, studying him, under the moonlight. "It's not just standing still," he said softly. "You're letting me in." Sentinel shifted his weight, blew through his nostrils, then lowered his head to the ground. The moon carved silver lines along his shoulders, lit the scar down his flank like an old medal. He looked less like a monster, and more like a sentinel should a guardian at rest. Watchful, but calm. Jack stayed until the chill crept into his bones. When he finally walked back to the house, the horse followed him with his eyes all the way to the porch. It wasn't victory, but it was forward. And sometimes forward was everything. The storm announced itself long before the first drop of rain. By noon, the air had turned heavy hot, charged with a strange metallic edge. Clouds stacked on the horizon like iron, the plates, their bellies swollen, their rims glowing faintly in the distance. The wind restless and shifting circled down the alleys of Little Creek as though hunting for a way inside. People knew the signs. Farmers fastened shutters with lengths of chain. Ranchers pushed cattle into barns, their movements clipped and urgent. The town itself braced like a man expecting a punch. At the edge of his property, Jack Mercer sat at his kitchen table, one hand around a cooling mug of coffee views fixed through the window on the corral. Sentinel was pacing head high, nostrils flaring at the change in pressure. The horse felt it too, the arrival of something vast and violent. By nightfall, the storm had swollen into a roar. The wind screamed like a freight train blasting down the valley. Rain hammered sideways, slamming into siding and glass. The rafters of the stallion shelter groaned, nails whining, braces vibrating under the strain. Each gust sounded like the world trying to rip the roof away. Jack pulled on his coat and went out. The first scream of metal came like the crack of artillery. A sheet of tin roofing ripped free and whirled into the night like a silver blade. Jack ducked, sprinting toward the corral boots, slapping mud. He had just reached the gate when the dependent world split with a groan. One of the heavy cross beams, loosened by the storm's fury, snapped in two. The weight came down fast, faster than he could step aside. The impact struck across his legs with the blunt certainty of a hammer. Jack went down hard, face pressed into mud breath, torn from his chest. Pain lit white behind his eyes, spreading like fire up his thighs. He clawed at the beam, tried to shove it off, but it was too heavy, too soaked, too locked in place. Rain sheetated across his back, ran cold into his collar, stung the open skin where splinters had scored him. He gritted his teeth and tried again, but the beam wouldn't budge. God damn it! His voice was lost in the storm. He was pinned, helpless. A new sound cut through the crash of splintering wood. Jack twisted his head and saw the fence explode outward. Posts toppled, wire snapped. In the lightning's flash, Sentinel's massive shape surged through the opening, a black silhouette against the storm. Mud flew as hooves dug deep muscles rippling like thunder in motion. Jack's chest sank. He's gone. Of course, he would run. Freedom lay wide and wild. Beyond the broken fence, a horse-like sentinel, born of scars and suspicion, would vanish into the plains and never look back. Jack closed his eyes, tasting despair and rainwater. Alone pinned, he imagined his body found in the morning light, drowned in mud, broken beneath timber. But the sound of retreat never came. Instead, there was a hesitation, a pause sharp enough to pierce through wind and thunder. He forced his eyes open. Out in the churn of rain and lightning stood Sentinel. The stallion had stopped dead-framed between freedom and duty. His head swung, ears locked forward, eyes burning like dark lanterns. Rain coursed down his massive neck, his chest heaving as he weighed two paths, the open world or the broken man in the wrecked mud. Jack gathered what air he could grit, mixing with water in his teeth. Sentinel, hold. The words tore out of him, raw, jagged, but they carried the weight of memory. The command was old, older than this. Storm. A syllable hammered into muscle and bone years ago on another continent. Sentinel froze. His ears snapped upright, his entire body locked like a soldier standing to attention at the crack of a drill sergeant's voice. Recognition flickered, not in human and reason, but in the deep, buried language of training and trust. The horse's neck arched. He threw his head up, bellowed a sound that shook the storm itself, then wheeled and charged back. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the sight. Not a beast in flight, but a war horse answering an order. He came in, low, shoulder-first hooves, tearing trenches through the mud. Jack braced himself. Sentinel slammed into the beam, with the full weight of his body. The wood shuddered, groaned, but held. The horse staggered back mud, spraying breath, exploding in white plumes against the rain. Again, Sentinel dropped his head, muscles tightening like steel cables. He lunged once more, the impact cracking through the night. This time, the timber screamed and splintered, bursting into jagged shards. Jack yanked his legs free, rolling sideways into the muck, gasping against the pain. His ankle burned sharp, his thighs throbbed with the echo of impact. But he was alive, alive because the horse had chosen him. Over the storm, Sentinel lowered his head, thrusting his muzzle close enough that Jack could feel the heat of his breath through the rain. Their exhales mingled human-animal. Survivor. Jack reached up, pressed a muddy hand against the stallion's neck. "Good boy," he gasped. "Good boy, you just saved me." Together, they staggered through the gale. Jack limped, leaning against posts that still stood. Sentinel stayed near his bulk, a living wall against the rain. When Jack faltered, the horse shifted, closer, his shoulder brushing Jack's arm as if to steady him. They reached the smaller lean-to by the shed, little more than corrugated tin bent into a half-shelter. Jack crawled inside, dragging his useless leg collapsed against the wall. Sentinel crowded in after filling the narrow space. His barrel side steamed in, the cold rain dripping down his flank. A fresh scrape bled along his shoulder, where the beam had bitten, but he stood square, no tremor of fear in him now. Jack leaned his cheek into the horse's hot hide. He could feel the pounding of Sentinel's heart, strong, insistent, matching the rhythm of his own. "You saved me," Jack whispered into the storm. "You didn't run, you came back." Sentinel didn't move away. He simply stood, ears flicking toward the wind, his body forming a wall that turned the rain. In that moment, Jack realized the roles had reversed. The man no longer guarding the horse guarding the man. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The rain eased to a thin drizzle, thunder rolling far off toward Oklahoma. The sky hung low and gray, but calmer. The yard looked as though a giant had passed through timbers. Scattered wire curled water, pulled in deep trenches. Jack limped across the wreckage. Sentinel, following at his shoulder like a shadow. Each step burned through his ankle, but he walked steady because the horse walked steady beside him. At the spare pen near the shed, he unlatched the gate. Sentinel stepped inside without fuss. No rearing, no lunging, no rage. He turned, planted his feet, and looked back at Jack. The gaze was changed. No longer the defiance of a prisoner waiting for a chance to escape. No longer the rolling whites of an animal trapped. It was focused, deliberate, watchful, the eyes of a sentry who had taken his post. Jack sank down into the mud just outside the rail. His body, ahawked, his lungs, burned, but his heart beat with something fierce and knew we're not strangers anymore. He said aloud, half to Sentinel, half to himself. The stallion blew softly, his ears angling forward as if listening. Jack closed his eyes, leaning back against the fence. The words of the SEAL creed rose again, not recited, but lived. No one left behind. That night, for the first time since bringing Sentinel home, Jack slept without fear. He had a comrade again, and this time, neither of them had been left behind. Dawn came clean and bright, as if the sky had decided to apologize for the night before. Sunlight struck the panhandle flat and hard, laying a bright blade across the Jack's yard. The place looked like a battlefield after the shooting stopped. Roofing torn and away. Crossbeams split wire, curled like shed snakes, skin puddles the color of coffee spread through the ruts. Mud streaked the house. The gate hung crooked, and the big corral leaned as though it had been tired for years and finally admitted it. A pickup rolled into the drive, then another. Ray Callahan climbed out of the first, sweeping his hat off as if he were stepping into church. Frank Dillard dropped from the other cab with a scowl set so deep it looked carved. Both men went still for a heartbeat, the way people do when they're bracing for the sight of a body. What they saw instead made them pause. Mid-breath, Jack Mercer was leading the black stallion across the yard with a slack rope. Sentinel walked at his shoulder, not crowding, not dragging, just there. Each step measured head level, ears forward. They moved like men sharing a burden. Frank's mouth opened and no words came out. Then, no way. That thing tried to kill me. Ray tugged the brim of his hat through his fingers, eyes narrowed against the different sun. He studied the horse the way he'd studied 1,000 horses, looking for the tell, the hard eye, the ready shoulder, the spring in the hawk that meant explosion. He didn't find it. He's not a monster now, Ray said quietly. Jack didn't gloat. He didn't explain. He just kept walking the rope loose, the stallion's shadow long beside him. He tied Sentinel in the shade of the shed for a moment, palmed the big neck, and looked up at the men like a man who'd come through something and didn't care to rehearse it for an audience. By midday this morning, Lauren Hale's silver truck crunched down the lane. She stepped out, took in the wreckage, then went straight to the horse. She said nothing at first. She didn't make the mistake of walking in fast or lifting hands to the face or doing anything that reads as predator in a prey animal's mind. She stopped at the shoulder, turned slightly sideways, and let Sentinel mark her. The stallion blinked. His ear flicked toward Jack, then back to her. Lauren moved along one step at a time, reading the small things. How the eyelids sat, whether the nostrils pinched the looseness in the tail, the quiet in the neck. She pressed the fingers into muscle, felt heat and tension, watched the breath. Jack stood, close enough that Sentinel could smell him. The big horse stayed balanced between them, confident in the space. Finally, she stepped back and looked at Jack, and there was a new note in her voice, something like respect that she didn't pass out cheaply. "This isn't a horse on guard anymore," she said. "This is a horse that trusts." The sentence landed with the thud of a stamp on a certificate. Riard? Frank heard it. They didn't argue. The words were too precise for that. Lauren glanced at the torn pen and the scraped shoulder. "Clean that cut. Keep him moving. Don't flood him." And Jack? She tipped her chin toward the wrecked yard. "Whatever happened last night, don't spend the next week trying to relive it. Let it be what it was." Jack nodded. Understood. She left with a small wave and a look at Sentinel that said she was surprised and maybe a little grateful to be surprised. News in Little Creek didn't need phones. It traveled on coffee, steam, and hay dust. By the noon rush at the diner, people were saying it out loud. The killer horse saved the seal. Forks hovered over eggs as men argued whether a horse could make that kind of choice. Someone pointed out that some horses run into burning barns for their foss. Why? Not for their person? Someone else snorted and talked about coincidence. At the blacksmith shop, the talk was simpler. He busted that pen to get to the man. The friar said, "Heating iron until it glowed." That's what the wreckage says. Kids drew the storm in chalk on sidewalks. A stick figure man pinned under a brown rectangle, lightning jagged across a sky, full of blue scribble, and a black horse with legs too long to stand on pushing a beam with his chest. They argued names on the playground. One boy said Sentinel sounded like a superhero. A girl said it sounded like a watchman on a wall. Either way, it stuck. There were still disbelievers. There always are. But disbelief is a funny currency. It spends poorly when reality keeps walking past the window. And reality was Jack riding the big horse at a cautious walk down Main. 2 afternoons later, halter rope in one hand, the other resting light on a stalwart neck. People on the sidewalks fell silent, then waved. Then when the pair passed without drama, went back to themselves, changed without quite knowing it. The county fair committee called. They wanted the horse, not as spectacle, they insisted, but his. Education put him in the farm and ranch learning corner. Let kids see what patience looked like when it wore hooves. Jack said, "No, then maybe, then yes, on 2 conditions, no crowding and no one gets to see how far they can push. The chairwoman said, "Of course." Jack didn't believe her. He went anyway. The fair smelled like sugar and diesel, and sun-warmed straw. Music thumped from the bandstand. Announcers barked from the rodeo ring. The livestock barns hummed with the noise of animals trying to make sense of Biddle. Louder animals. Sentinel came off the trailer high and tight, eyes hunting ears, chopping air. Jack walked a circle with him behind the education tent until the big lungs blew long and the head dropped a notch. He stood at the horse's shoulder, kept his voice low, his body between the noise and his animal. Condition 1. Enforced. Kids lined up, as kids do immediately and crookedly. Volunteers tried to make them straight. Jack let the crooked stand. "One at a time," he said. "No sneaking. Keep your hand flat and let him see you coming." Parents hovered with phones. A few fathers had the lean-in elbows, wide posture of men who wanted to test for themselves. Jack's glance met theirs and made the point. Condition 2. Enforced. The first boy reached out like something might bite. Sentinel breathed across the small palm and didn't flinch. The second kid lost her nerve and stepped back. Jack said that was fine. There are other days. The third was a girl in a yellow dress with a ribbon worked loose from her hair. She laid her hand on the soft place above the stallion's nostril, and for reasons she didn't need to explain to. "Anybody," whispered Shadow Guardian. The words were little and private. The reaction wasn't. The adults around them exhaled that low collective sound people make when something true and unexpected drops into the middle of their day. Someone laughed. Someone else wiped at an eye. Jack's mouth tilted. He didn't repeat it. A nickname is a gift you don't demand twice. Sentinel stood. When the tent side snapped in the wind, he tossed his head, then found Jack's shoulder again and settled. He accepted the touch of children and the noise that came with them, with a weary generosity of someone learning a new language in real time. In the afternoon, the fair program rolled toward recognitions and remarks. Someone grabbed Ray Callahan because in small counties, you grab the man with a microphone voice and ask him to say words. He looked like he'd prefer a branding iron to a podium, but he climbed the steps anyway, hat in hand, the boards underfoot creaking. "Folks," he said, and the word came out raw than usual. "You all know me. I sell horses. Been selling them longer than I care to count. Couple weeks back, I stood in our auction yard and I told you one was a monster. I damn near send him down a road none of us say out loud." He glanced toward Jack, who stood beside Sentinel at the tent's edge. He swallowed once and kept going. "I was wrong." He let the phrase sit. "You don't get many men saying it in public out here. Sentinel ain't just a horse. He's a comrade that got left behind and found in his way home." Applause rose unevenly, then caught like dry grass and ran through the crowd. Some people clapped because you're meant to, some because they'd watched and changed their minds, a few because something in the words hit a place they didn't visit often. Frank Dillard stood off to the side, arms crossed, jaw working. When Ray stepped down, Frank didn't walk up to the mic. He didn't say I was wrong, and no one expected him to. He just dipped, his head a fraction toward Jack, which in its way was a heavier sentence than any apology. By evening, photos had already outrun the event. Kids with palms pressed to black muzzle, Jack walking past, bunting the lead rope, a lazy line. Sentinel caught in the slant of golden light, looking nothing like a demon and everything like a presence. At the feed store the next morning, a woman sent the clerk a picture on her phone and asked for the same grain Jack bought. At the grocery, the cashier said, "Saw Shadow Guardian yesterday," then corrected herself and added Sentinel, like she was learning how to say two names for the same truth. On the street, people stopped to look the horse in the eye without flinching. The old reflex, "don't meet the gaze of a dangerous thing," was replaced by the newer one, "meet it and nod." Jack didn't chase any of it. He let the town make what it wanted from the stories, told people who they were. If the folks in Little Creek believed fear could turn into respect with patience and grit, Jack wasn't the man to argue. But the truth was, the best moments weren't born under bunting or applause. They came quietly, when the heat broke and the land seemed to breathe again. In the fading light, Jack would saddle the black giant with steady hands, no need to announce a thing. Sentinel would square himself, offering the small grace of making it easier, and together they would move out into the back pasture. The grass, reborn after the storm, stretched green against the endless horizon. Crickets sang, meadowlarks stitched melodies along fence wire, and the air smelled of dust forgiven. Jack loosened the reins until they were little more than suggestion. Sentinel's ears flicked. balanced between the rustle of brush and the man's quiet breath. Out there, Jack didn't think about the names he once carried, one from a faraway battlefield, another whispered by a girl in a yellow dress at a county fair. He thought about the creed that had shaped him and nearly destroyed him. No one left behind. It was written for soldiers, but under this sky, it fit just as well. His palm rested on the horse's warm neck. "We keep the oath," he murmured, so soft the wind might have stolen it, "even if the comrade looks like a horse." Sentinel shook his mane, the small thunder rolling down his crest, and blew a breath that misted the cooling air. Call it agreement, call it wind, it didn't matter. They turned for home as the light faded from gold to indigo. No one waited at the gate. No cameras, no applause, just the rhythm of hooves and the beating of two battered hearts. Jack dismounted, loosened the cinch, and stood there a while. His hand pressed to the place where the saddle had been, feeling the quiet that had taken root between them. Inside, the old pipes knocked. Outside, the horse lowered his head to graze, not because he was told it was safe, but because he believed it. The town would keep its story alive, about the monster that wasn't, and the man who wouldn't quit. But Jack didn't need the legend. He had the life. And then, just as he turned to head inside, the silence shattered. Sentinel's head jerked up, ears pinned, muscles coiling tight. In the gathering dark, a shape moved along the fence line. Too smooth, too deliberate to be the wind. Jack froze, hand drifting to the old reflex that never left him. The war, it seemed, wasn't as far behind as he thought. The oath wasn't finished yet.